So we've all played Wii Sports. Even almost 20 years after its first release, it feels fresh and original. Which is, it's crazy to think that it's been 20 years almost since Wii Sports came out. Dang. But yeah, I still find myself coming back to it every once in a while just to enjoy a round or two of one of the sports. Which, let's be real, it's bowling. I come back for the bowling. It got me thinking though, even though Blender isn't a game engine, it does have a real-time physics system. So I figured, why not combine Wii Sports and Blender and see if I could make a playable game entirely from scratch within Blender. So I made 3 out of 5 games from the original Wii Sports, and I apologize to the baseball and boxing fans out there, but let's jump right in and take a look. So let's take a look at tennis. The way I got tennis to work is by making the tennis ball a rigid body, and then giving the player a surrounding box that's slightly transparent and making that a rigid body as well. When the animation is playing, you can move your character, which moves the rigid body, and you can interact with the ball. And then for the opponent, I had to kind of go a slightly janky route, but it's a simple solution that is somewhat effective. I basically just added an invisible wall and ceiling so that the ball bounces against it. So it's basically playing tennis against yourself, like practicing your shots against a brick wall. But I tried to make it look convincing, and as long as you don't look at it too closely, it sort of does the trick. To add a little more detail, I added some characters to the scene, and I added tracking constraints to them. So their heads actually have a tracking constraint that rotates their heads towards the position of the ball, so they're always looking at it. And your opponent also can move to follow the ball around. So it just gives kind of a nice animated effect. And they all blink as well. Same buddy, I feel you, I feel you. So as janky as it is, it's actually kind of fun to play. And although the fine tuning of the physics took some time, it still requires some finesse to get right. And by finesse, I mean if you hit it too hard, it goes out of the court and through the hotel window. All that aside, I think it's about time we take a look at a full game of tennis. So I'm not gonna lie, I actually practiced like maybe 5 or 6 rounds, and I absolutely got my butt handed to me by Matt all 5 times. And this is the first time I actually won. So I'll chalk that up to all the practice I put in. But yeah, that's tennis for you. Let's take a look at our next sport. Now, I couldn't remake Wii Sports without adding bowling. It's definitely the most iconic of the 5 original sports. And in order to get it to work in Blender, I had to go about it a little differently than tennis. So instead of having a rigid body that you move around yourself, your bowling throw is driven by a geometry node input. So that input acts as a driver to a couple things, including animation and material transparency, but functionally it moves a force. So basically, as you move the slider up, the force spreads out, and then it moves the ball down the alley off of an invisible launch pad with a small ramp at the end. So it kind of creates a somewhat realistic, believable movement of the ball in your hand. Although, obviously, if you look too close, it kind of falls apart. But it does the trick. And the great thing about this is there's enough nuance to make the throws unique. So originally I was worried about you basically just move the slider from 0 to 1, roll your throw, and then it would just be the same every time. So you'd be able to really mess with the system by just lining your shot up the same and then getting strike after strike. It's got a little bit of finesse to it, and it makes it so the gameplay is a lot more interesting. And we'll see that in the game that I played, where I actually only got 1 strike. So I might have over-tuned it to the extreme of the other end. So just like tennis, I wanted to add some background detail to make the bowling alley feel more alive. So I added background characters again, and a lot of them have the same constraints in node systems from tennis, where they can blink and watch the ball and stuff. And I also added a bunch of other small details. So there's a user interface from your camera that shows you which pins you've knocked over. You have to manually enter the pins that you knocked over, just because I couldn't figure out a way to calculate that. But I added numbering onto the alley itself, so it makes it a little easier to tell which pins you've knocked over. And I even added a sweeper. It doesn't have a lot of practical use, to be honest. I mean, it's just you have to manually activate it, but I mean, it still works. So, you know, you can't say I didn't put a sweeper in it. Let's bowl a game, see how it goes. So 138 is not a very good score. I bowled better in real life and in Wii Bowling. Even still, 138 not being a good score. I'm pretty happy with where it's at, because it was honestly kind of hard to find the balance between making the game super ridiculously easy and impossible. It took a lot of fine-tuning the physics on the pins, so adjusting the weight, adjusting the origins, stuff like that. It took a lot of time, but I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. So yeah, that's bowling. And now let's take a look at our final sport. So our last sport today is golf, which I personally warmed up to quite a bit. I think it was my least favorite as a kid. Like, I kind of avoided it, but I've really come around to golf. I find it enjoyable. And I think out of the 3 sports that I made, I think golf turned out the best. I'm the most proud of it, I think. Even though, honestly, I think they all turned out pretty well. The first thing you'll notice is that golf has a much more in-depth user interface. So it shows things like your current club, the wind speed, your character's current distance from the hole even. And each one of your 3 clubs, driver, iron, and putter, have unique dynamics that affect the ball differently. So in principle, it works similar to the bowling, where a force just pushes the ball. But this one has 3 forces, and they're lined up so that only one affects the ball at a time. And then when you select your club, it just moves the correct force into place. And they all have different force amounts and angles, so it affects the ball differently. Like, the driver sends the ball into the air, whereas the putter just kind of sends it perpendicular to the ground. And just like you'd want in golf, it gives you different results for different clubs. But the system works well enough, allowing you to make putts with a driver if you want. So it's not just 0 to 1 like a switch where it goes 0 and then it sends it off into the sky. You can actually gently do a shot with all 3 clubs. And even though the club swing is just visual and it's not functional, it does line up fairly convincingly. Even if you go slow, it looks like it's actually interacting with the ball. And so I'm happy with that. I did originally try to make the club a rigid body that actually moved the ball instead of having a force, because I felt like that was more realistic. But it was just way too inconsistent, and it didn't work anywhere near as well as using a force instead. So you do need to manually move your character to the ball after each shot before you reset the animation. But I did add a shrink wrap constraint, so when you move your player, it just follows the terrain height as you move it around. So it does make it a little bit easier. One last thing is the wind speed and direction in the actual game is randomized. I couldn't figure out a way to do that, just interacting with drivers and all that. So it took some compromise, but you can adjust the speed and direction yourself. And the flag is actually a cloth physics object, so it will wave in the wind according to the direction and strength. So I thought that was pretty cool. I ended up getting par on golf. So yeah, I'm honestly pretty happy with that. So yeah, everything in this video was made from scratch. A lot of geometry nodes, like the animations, they use curves. So when your hand moves, it's basically sampling a curve and then setting a position along that. And it also moves whatever you're holding as well. Most of the textures were made using shader nodes. And I even made a simple geometry node based tree generator for the golf and tennis. I honestly I had such a good time making this. It was such a fun project, and it really continued to grow my respect for Blender and the many tools it has. It's so cool. Like, I love it so much. I love Blender. It's the best. Like, I can't talk about it enough. So along those lines, more videos coming soon. I hope to be more consistent. As far as closing out, I do have Patreon now. I really wanted to put my files from this project onto Patreon, but just because it's Nintendo, I didn't want to take that risk. So if there's enough interest, I will put a more generic version of these projects up for you all to play. But either way, going forward into the future, that's where I will put my project files, so you can access those. It's a great way to support me as well and the growth of the channel. Also, just wanted to say thank you for getting to almost 1,000 subscribers. I really appreciate that. And last but not least, I wanted to give a shout out to Flowerhead, who actually specifically for this video made the intro song, which is the kind of knockoff version of the Wii Sports song. So go check him out. He's awesome. He does great stuff. And seriously, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.